The confirmation of Lloyd Austin as the first black U.S. Secretary of Defense is a milestone. Nick Schifrin reports on how it also spotlights racial disparities at the highest level of the military ranks.
Hello, everybody.
When Lloyd Austin arrived at the Pentagon today, he broke through what's been called the brass ceiling. In a 40-year career, he was the first black officer to command a division in combat, the first black officer to command an entire theater of war, and now the first black Secretary of Defense.
To hit every single one of those gates is incredible. So to me, that is much like hitting the lottery.
Irving Smith is a retired Army colonel and former West Point professor. He says the military provides opportunity for black enlisted troops to rise to positions like sergeant, but to rise through the officer ranks, like four-star General Austin did, the barriers are systemic. He read a 1995 U.S. Army War College research project, Why Black Officers Fail, and in 2010 he wrote a follow-up, Why Black Officers Still Fail.
There's this thing called the Good Old Boy Network. There's a system in the Army that is it's like nepotism that exists there. And as long as that persists, black officers will have a very hard time making it to the senior ranks.
In 1994, black soldiers were 27% of the Army, but only 11% of the officers. 2007, black soldiers were 20% of the Army, but only 12% of the officers. Today, the problem persists. The Pentagon provided PBS NewsHour data we analyzed for the entire military. Black service members are 16% of the military, but only 8% of its officers. White service members are 55% of the military, but 72% of the officers. A major problem, the lack of black mentorship.
Most of the African-American officers were coming out of historically black colleges, and those historically black colleges weren't providing the mentorship up front, whereas the West Point cadets were getting the very best officers to teach them from day one. And so they weren't necessarily being given the right guidance on the right assignments to take.
That's a reference to the military's combat units, where black service members are 11% of the enlisted, but only 5% of the officers. White combat service members are 64% of the enlisted and 78% of the officers. In fact, in combat units, as the percentage of white officers rises with seniority, the percentage of black officers drops from 8% of second lieutenants down to 4% for colonels. In combat support units such as logistics, the disparity remains, but the numbers get better. Black service members are 20% of the enlisted and 10% of the officers. Smith says that's indicative of black soldiers self-selecting.
I came into the Army because I was going to do 5 years, get out, and make a lot of money, right? I fell in love with the Army when I was in the Army, and I found my calling when I was there. But my parents were like, why did you go into the infantry? That was the dumbest thing you could do. Why didn't you go in the Signal Corps where you could learn to work satellites and get a job at, some big satellite company afterwards?
Smith says young black soldiers who choose support roles like Signal Corps limits the number of black officers who become generals.
It's well known that the combat units, those combat arms professions, produce the senior leaders of the future.
There is no justifiable reason for discrimination.
The military is proud of its past efforts to fight racism. Thanks to a President Truman executive order, the military was one of the first American institutions to integrate. Black men have risen to its most senior ranks. Colin Powell, the first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and just last summer, Air Force General C.Q. Brown, the first black service chief. But before he was confirmed, he posted a video about the racism that he experienced.
I'm thinking about the pressure I felt to perform error-free, especially for supervisors I perceived had expected less from me as an African American.
We can't just lay this on a black leader to say, go fix this. The Caucasian leaders of the services, have to fix this issue, have to really go after it.
Admiral Mike Mullen was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 2007 to 2011. Today, he voiced rare criticism of his successors.
Do you believe that the current leadership across the military has taken this as a priority?
The current leadership of the military has not taken it as a priority, and I think the evidence is just in the numbers. Look at the lack of senior four-stars in particular who are Black or Hispanic.
Mullen hired Austin to be the Joint Staff Director. One day, Austin told his boss, "Come downstairs to take a photo." Never before had so many senior Black officers helped lead the Joint Staff.
And I said, "What's all this about?" And one of them said, "This is history." And every one of them was doing an exceptional job for me.
To increase the percentage of Black officers, Mullen says that Old Boys Network has to change from the lowest ranks.
I've had this theory forever on these promotion boards. There's a phrase I use, ducks pick ducks. And these boards are dominated by Caucasian senior officers, typically. It's hard to break that. And this is a long-term issue where you have to enlarge the pool there in order to expect to be able to promote people to admiral and generals.
Smith says commanders should be judged by the diversity of their staff and the climates they create, and that ROTC programs must be improved. He's confident that Secretary Austin can do that.
This is a great occasion, not for Black America, but for America.
If the saying is, "I cannot be what I cannot see," today every young service member can see him. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.